and welcome back to the second part of my anime primer on Yoshiyuki Tomino, the legend who created Gundam, among many other things. And today I'm going to talk about Gundam itself and the Gundam works that Tomino himself did. Now, as I mentioned in the first part, he did quite a few shows before Gundam, and then after the first Gundam tanked, he made several other Gundam series. I may have misspoken in the first one and said that other Gundams had been made since, but not true. He did Gundam, Ideon, Zabungle, Dunbin, El Game, the other anime, and then he moved back to the Gundam franchise after actually the original Gundam movies did quite well in movies, the compilation movies. So, but before I get into that, I need to explain why Gundam? What's the big deal about Gundam? And very briefly, a couple of things. One is that Gundam was very specifically aimed at an older audience than anime had been aimed at before. Up until this point, anime was very much aimed at kids. It was much like cartoons were here in America up until very, 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 very recently. And still is, really. Anime was for kids. Manga, some adults could read that, but anime for kids. And you could see that in the protagonists. Usually the protagonists of any anime were little kids. With Gundam, the protagonists are all 15 years old or older. 15, 19, 20. And so it was obviously aimed at mid-teens, older teens, and young adults. Also, there was this big economic advantage. Now, mecha series have always had a very tight connection with toy companies. Basically, the toy companies license the designs from the anime company, and that money helps to fund the anime. And if the toys sell well, then the anime companies does well. What happened with Gundam is that because it appealed to an older audience, you had folks who weren't just buying the hero mecha and a bad guy mecha and doing this with them. They were collecting things. You had actual collectors here, and because you got older folks doing this. So instead of just fighting two things together, all of a sudden you're setting up dioramas, and so you need a Gundam and 3 Zaku. Aha! Now you need more more kits, and you need more detail in your figurines and your model kits. So Gundam was able to sell a lot of model kits eventually. And this helped, to encourage anime makers to make anime for older audiences. And honestly, this changed anime from a kid-oriented medium to at least a teenager, young adult-oriented medium. I mean, this was many years before Ghost in the Shell or Akira. And this helped to shift this idea that, you can actually tell a serious story. And that's one of the things. Gundam is a war story. It is not simply humans versus aliens. It is like a World War II documentary or a dramatization just about a war in the future instead of World War II or World War I. So it has this very serious, very documentary style feel to it. And if you can get past the sort of cheesy animation and just the very era appropriate effects and voices and so forth, you'll find this is a surprisingly serious, surprisingly mature look at things. I mean, Amuro, the main character, gets essentially post-traumatic stress disorder. He goes through all sorts of problems. There's lots of psychology going on there, which is interesting. And it didn't work. I mean, Gundam bombed when it first came out. In fact, it got canceled partway through. They only did 43 episodes instead of 50, and they had to rush to cram all the story into the last few episodes. So it kind of died, which is why Tomino went off. But then he made some compilation movies, and Gundam started getting more and more popular. Sleeper hit. It just kept on getting people in and watching and watching and watching. And so he finally came back in 1985 and did Zeta Gundam. Now, Zeta Gundam is the Empire Strikes Back of Gundam series. You want dark. This is a dark series. It's not adventurous. It's not sci-fi, action-y. Although it is beautifully animated, it's got some fantastic sequences. I mean, animation is night and day between that and original Gundam. But I mentioned before, Tomino had this Kill 'Em All Tomino nickname. It's in full force here. I mean, I think, depending on how you count, there are 4 characters left alive at the end of Zeta. Yeah. Now, there are mechanics and stuff around too. But, Zeta's dark and tough, and I want to say here, if you ever get a chance to go and see Zeta, be aware, for those who've seen it that I know of, including myself, you watch it and it's okay, and you kind of enjoy it, and there's good aspects to it, but it just doesn't seem to come together, and it seems like a mess. And the characters just don't really work. And then when you finish, you think back, you're like, well, and you know, that kind of fit together. The more you think about it, the more it fits together. And it's one of the very few anime that's like this, where actually it ages like a fine wine. And just things seem to make more and more sense, seem to fit together better, and seem much more deliberate and much more effective than when you were watching the show. And I don't know why. But Zeta was really, really remarkable in that way. And also Zeta helped to bring good animation into the Gundam franchise. A year later, Tomino made a sequel series, Double Zeta Gundam. Now, the remarkable thing here is each of these Gundam series are done in sequence, in time. So each one is set right after the other. In fact, Zeta takes place literally like a day after Zeta ends. But by this point, mecha anime in general had gotten a lot more serious, a lot more dramatic, and a lot more depressing. And Tomino wanted to shift away from that a bit, and he made Double Zeta more lighthearted. Unfortunately, the fandom didn't want it to be lighthearted, and so they reacted very strongly against this. The other problem was that partway through pre-production, Tomino was told by Sunrise they had the budget to make a movie, a Gundam movie, original story. And this was not long after Nausicaa the Valley of Wind had come out, and the Macross movie, do you remember Love? That had come out. So the idea is now we can do a Gundam movie. And so Tomino reworked some of the storylines in Double Zeta kind of the last minute, and essentially pulled Char Aznable out of Double Zeta and put him in Char's counterattack. And this didn't help the plot much, and things kind of were a little more shaky as a result of that. But Double Zeta, it did fine. And then out came Char's counterattack in 1988. Beautifully animated, kind of hard to follow, kind of weird, and an instant classic, but not something you want to start someone off with anime. It is very much a Gundam thing, but huge, very, very big, very popular. And the next thing Tomino did, in fact, in 1991, was Gundam F91. And this was one of his original ideas for an entire TV show, which they decided to make a movie out of. Now, that's hard to fit 50 episodes into a movie. And he does a pretty good job. I mean, F91 works. It's comprehensible. There's a good number of characters. There's a fine ending battle sequence. It's just a full Gundam TV storyline just isn't really meant for a movie, an hour and a half. So it has just those sorts of, why are we've got all these characters kind of a feel. But it works fine. Unfortunately, by this point, folks were not too thrilled with the way Gundam was moving. The stories were starting to suffer. And this was even worse in Victory Gundam, 1993, which Tomino also directed. And I love the character work in Victory Gundam, but Victory is a bit of a mess. I mean, there's battle after battle with nothing really being accomplished. There's weird mecha, and Kill 'Em All Tomino is back in full force. People die right and left in Victory. And you've got younger protagonists, and so you're watching them with their friends and family getting killed right and left, and it's nah. And Victory certainly has its charms, but it's like things weren't going very well at this point. And in fact, it went so poorly for Sunrise that they ended up getting bought out by Bandai in sort of a friendly takeover, who took them over and said, okay, Tomino, you need to stop doing Gundam for a while. Let other folks do some Gundam. You go off and do other things. And we'll talk about those other things in the next and final segment of this primer on Yoshiyuki Tomino.